So today I will be presenting to you, as Katarina already mentioned, a part of my doctoral thesis. And my presentation will be entitled Contested Cultural Landscapes, a case study from Bakhchisaray district in Crimea, Ukraine. And here I put Ukraine in brackets because I was not really sure how to go with that. Because as you might have heard, last year in April 2014, a referendum was held in Crimea. It was agreed by the people, or maybe it was not, no one really knows, that they would like the peninsula to be transferred to Russian Federation. So the Russian Federation annexed Crimea. This annexation was not acknowledged by any other countries of the world, and therefore the status of Crimea is unclear. Hence the question mark in my title. So just to give you some, you can see it. Just to give you some idea where Crimea exactly is located, you can see that it is the southernmost point of Ukraine. It is a peninsula that is situated on the northern coast of the Black Sea. And owing to its very unique strategic position, Crimea has always, since the antique time, been a very highly diverse, multi-ethnic and multi-religious location. Throughout history, the cultural landscapes of Crimea were shaped and transformed under the influence of its ever-changing populations. Until nowadays, Crimea remains as rich in historic, archaeological, and religious heritage as it is rich in its ethnically and religiously diverse population. Just to give you a very brief overview of Crimea's extremely turbulent history, I have put together this timeline, which begins in the 1st century AD. Obviously, the history of Crimea begins much, much, much earlier and follows this line until the end of the 20th century. So as you can see, from the 1st and until the 3rd centuries AD, Crimea, which was at the time known as Taurica, formed the part of the Roman Empire, and namely the Bosporan Kingdom of the Roman Empire. Then, in the middle of the 3rd century, Rome began to lose its influence, and in the 4th century AD, the Byzantine Empire, which was basically the eastern extension of the Roman Empire, took control of this region. Then, in the 6th century, the status of Roman Crimea changed, and it became part of the Byzantine province of Chersonesus, which covered all of the southern coast of the peninsula. At the same time, in the 7th century, there happened a rise of the Muslim, or rather not Muslim, but a very multicultural and multi-ethnic formation, which is known in history as Khazar Khaganat. It is, so to say, an agglomerate state that united semi-nomadic Turkic tribes, collectively known as the Khazars. The Khazars took control of nearly the whole of Crimea, apart from its southern and southwestern parts, which still remained under the control of the Byzantine Empire. The population of the Khazar Khaganat appears to have been very multi-confessional, and it was a mosaic of pagan populations mixed with the Jewish, Christian, and Muslims. Then, starting from the 13th century, a number of ports in Crimea fell in the hands of the Golden Horde, which was a Turkicized state that originated as the northwestern sector of the Mongol Empire. And also the mountainous area of Crimea at the same time were in the control of the Goths, who in the 14th century established their state, the so-called Principality of Theodora, with the capital in Mangup. And thusly you can see that from the middle of the 13th century and up to the second half of the 15th century, Crimea was basically split in 3 parts, each professing their own religions. We had the Muslim Golden Horde domains, with their center in Solkhat. And in 1443, an independent Crimean Khanate as part of the Golden Horde was formed. Then we had the Catholic Genoese colonies with their center in Kaffa, and at the same time we had that Orthodox Principality of Theodora with its capital in Mangup. In May 1475, both the Principality of Theodora and the Genoese colonies were attacked by the Ottoman Turks, who conquered the peninsula and kept it under control until the second half of the 18th century. In the 1760s, the Ottoman Empire got involved in the Russo-Turkish War, and as a result of this war, it lost Crimea, and the Crimea was transferred to the Russian Empire. It was officially annexed in 1783 and remained known as the so-called Taurida province of the Russian Empire until the Socialist Revolution of 1917. After the revolution, as we know, the empire no longer existed. And then in 1921, Crimea was integrated in the Russian Socialist Federative Republic. And in 1954, it was given over from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine automatically remained a part of the newly born independent state of Ukraine. And as I said, my timeline basically stops here. But then in 2014, it again sort of came back under the jurisdiction of Russia, but it's still not decided how to go around with it, with the annexation. So as it followed from this historical overview, Crimea has been culturally shaped by a very wide variety of different ethnic and religious groups throughout history, and of course this process directly impacted the formation and transformation of Crimea's cultural landscapes. In my doctoral research, I focused on how the cultural landscapes of Crimea were formed and transformed in this multicultural and multi-religious environment, and in which ways they are protected currently by the state and also by the local ethno-religious communities who view themselves as the custodians of these landscapes. Of course, taking the whole of the peninsula as a case study would be a huge work, which would probably be enough for 3 doctoral theses. So I had to focus on only one district, which is the Bakhchisaray district. You can see it in the red circle. It is located in the southwest of Crimea. The reason why I chose exactly this place is that of all the parts of Crimea, perhaps this part had the most turbulent history of all. And it had a history of ever-changing populations and religions coming and going and interchanging their ideas and interchanging beliefs. So I think that this part is really a very interesting case study for an investigation, and just to present to you and to show you how multicultural it remains until today, I will present very shortly the population statistics, and the statistics goes back to 2014, which means basically that it's very recent. So as you can see, the major groups of which the population is comprised are the Russians, Ukrainians, and the Crimean Tatars, with Russians comprising 56% of the population, the Crimean Tatars 23%, Ukrainians 13%, and also we have 8% of other, but you should know that by other we mean actually a lot of different ethnic and religious groups, including the Belarusians and Armenians and Uzbeks and Azerbaijani and Moldovans and Greeks and Turkish and Poles and Germans and Georgians, and last but not least, the Crimean Karaites. This very last group is very essential part of my doctoral research because it was one of the minorities that left a very noticeable material heritage behind itself, so to say. They are still existent. I think there are around 800 people, or maybe a bit less now. As I will show you later, they have contributed a lot, even though the size of this community is so small. They have contributed a lot to the development of the district's cultural landscapes. And so the value and the significance of the area was recognized by the Ukrainian state, and in 2002, Ukraine put forward the nomination called Bakhchisaray Palace of Crimean Huns and put it on the World Heritage tentative list. Then, in 2012, the decision was taken to expand this nomination and also to include not only the residents of the Crimean Huns, but also some of the surroundings. Apart from the palace itself, the nomination was extended and sort of resubmitted, and now it includes also a number of other cultural heritage assets. All of them are located in the geographic proximity to one another and are all very harmoniously embedded in Bakhchisaray's natural landscapes. The most prominent of these heritage sites include, apart from the Han Palace itself, also the historic district of Salachik, which is not far from the palace, the cave town and the former Crimean Karaite capital Chufut-Kale, and also 2 old cemeteries, one of the Crimean Tatars, which is called Gazi Mansur Cemetery, and the other of the Crimean Karaites, which is called the Baltati Mes Cemetery. For the convenience of my research, I have divided these major heritage sites in 3 clusters, depending on their relevance for different ethno-religious groups. And thus we have the Crimean Tatar cluster, which is comprised of the Han Palace, the historical district of Salachik, and the Gazi Mansur Cemetery. Then I had the Christian Orthodox cluster, which includes the complex of rock churches of the Assumption Monastery, and also the Crimean Karaite cluster, which includes Chufut-Kale, the cave town, and the Karaite capital, and also the sacred oak grove, Baltati Mes, with the medieval Karaite cemetery. Just to very shortly present you the significance of each of these elements, I will probably start with the most ancient of them, which is the Monastery of Assumption. The monastery was founded by the Byzantine Greeks in the 8th century at the site of the purported miraculous revelation of an icon of a Holy Mother of God. There are legends circulated in the peninsula that once a shepherd saw light, up on the rock, and then when he came closer, he saw the holy icon, which was soaring in the air. He brought a ladder, and he went up and took the icon away and took it home. But then the next day, he realized that the icon is not at home, but it is gone. When he came back, it was back, soaring and shining. And so the local people decided the local Greeks decided to found a monastery in this place. So is the legend. And the monastery basically operated more or less continuously until the end of the 18th century, when the Greeks were resettled from Crimea to the Azov Sea coast in the 1970s. It includes a number of rock churches, and after the Greeks left the peninsula, some decades later, the Russian Empire initiated a very massive campaign of, which they called the so-called the Crimean Ethos campaign. They wanted to rebuild, restore, and reopen all of the Orthodox churches in the peninsula so as, to prove the continuity of Christianity in Crimea from the ancient times and until present. And thus they wanted to link so to say, the culture of the Russian Empire with the Byzantine culture. The monastery was reopened in 1850, and then it existed and was flourishing until 1921, when the social revolution struck, so to say, and all monasteries and all churches were closed. It was closed down, all of its churches were demolished, and only one of them remained, which is the Church of the Holy Assumption, the one that you see in the picture, right here. During the 1940s and the 1950s, this monastery complex was used for many things. It was used as a military hospital, as a mental hospital. And finally, in 1993, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the religious revival in Ukraine started again, the territory of the monastery was returned to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, and the monastery was reopened. And until now, it remains one of the major pilgrimage destinations, not only in Crimea, but overall in Ukraine. Then we have the second case study, which is the Karaite cluster, and includes the Chufut-Kale cave town and the cemetery with the oak grove, named Baltati Mes. The first defensive complex on Chufut-Kale dates back to the 6th century AD. As you can see, these are one of the earliest defensive caves that were built on top of the Chufut-Kale plateau. In 1299, the fort was captured by Nogai, emir of the Golden Horde. And in the 14th century, we also have the first accounts of the Karaites arriving, and the first accounts of the burials on the Baltati Mes cemetery. The Tatars and the Karaites coexisted for a very long time and cohabitated Chufut-Kale. And in 1941, it even became temporarily the capital of the Crimean Khanate. Then, in the 16th century, when the Tatar capital was transferred to Salachik and then to Bakhchisaray, Karaites remained more or less by themselves in the town, and they lived there very peacefully until the end of the 19th century, when the town was gradually abandoned due to difficulties with water supply, because it is situated really high on top of a plateau, and they have had troubles for centuries with transporting water up there. The town is the place where the two major Karaite churches, not churches, but so to say, the synagogues, because Karaites are is a branch of Judaism in a way, and therefore their churches, so to say, the buildings themselves and how they are made and how their structures are very similar to the synagogues, and they are called the Kenaseh. There are two of them in Çufutkale. The cemetery with the sacred oak grove, as I said, the first credible records that we have of its existence date back to the 14th century. The Karaites believe that the oaks among which the cemetery is located have special superpowers of connecting the living with the dead, and they think that it is through these oaks that the energy of the dead that are buried underneath goes into the sky, and also it comes back to the community which lives there nowadays. So it's a kind of this cycle, you know, of energetic cycle of getting the power from the ancestors through the oaks and back to the community. Then we have the third cluster, which is the Crimean Tatar cluster with the town of Bakhchisaray and Gazi Mansur Cemetery. Gazi Mansur Cemetery was first also mentioned in the 15th century, and it is considered and believed to be the purported burial site of the three Muslim saints. Then, as I said already, in the 1500s, Salachik, which is one of the suburbs of Bakhchisaray, became the capital of the Crimean Khanate, and the very famed Zincirli Medrese is a religious school, was opened there in 1501. It became the cultural and the religious and the educational center of the whole peninsula. In 1532, the capital of the Crimean Khanate was transferred from Salachik to the new place, to the town of Bakhchisaray itself, where the palace was constructed. And it existed until 1736, when the palace was burned down by the Russian army in the course of the Russo-Turkish War. Then, in 1783, when Crimea was annexed by Russia, the Khanate was abolished, and the palace then remained for 2 centuries as a temporary residence of Russian highly honored guests. In 1917, after the Socialist Revolution, the National Museum of Crimean Tatars was opened in the palace, and then in the 1990, the National Museum was reorganized in the State Bakhchisaray Historical and Cultural Preserve. And all of these properties remain on the territory of this Bakhchisaray Historical and Cultural Preserve. So preserve governs them. It is the preserve that carries out all the research activities and safeguarding activities, recording, and also awareness-raising activities. Just to very shortly give you an overview why Ukraine decided to put this property of historical surroundings of Crimean Han's capital in Bakhchisaray on the tentative list, is that it wanted to stress that it possesses the outstanding universal value under 4 different criteria. So firstly, it's criteria 2, they suppose that the Bakhchisaray Palace of the Crimean Khans, which is the architectural ensemble of the 15th and 17th century, has had considerable influence on the architecture and monumental art in Crimea in the 19th and 20th centuries. Also, criterion 3, whereby it is believed that Çufutkale settlement is a unique example of ancient urban ensemble with a system of fortifications, which reflects a particular cultural tradition of the multinational Crimea cultural area. Then we have criteria 5 also. The historical and cultural ensembles of the Bakhchisaray Valley present outstanding samples of the harmonious combination of human activities and landscape. And also criterion 6, which interested me particularly in the framework of my research, which is the associative value of the suggested property. And it says that Çufutkale, Salachik, and Bakhchisaray have been and remain centers of high political and cultural importance for the communities that are inhabited with as well as contribute to cultural and historic integration of the communities that make the Ukrainian nation. And this last part basically fascinated me a lot of all these criteria, because with the first one it's more or less clear, because I was really wondering when I saw this nomination that, okay, it is clear that it's a center of high political and cultural importance, but how exactly does it contribute so much to the cultural and historic integration of different communities that make up the Ukrainian nation? And also, is it really so that despite that so many different cultural and religious heritages that are, that comprise this nomination, is it really a shared heritage, or is it more of a contested heritage that is being, contested between different ethno-religious groups? So I started thinking of that, and I was looking for an approach to evaluate the situation. So I was asking myself, how can we actually see, and from which perspective we can actually deduce whether or not this heritage is shared? And the core of my approach lies in the fact that I perceive heritage not as some kind of a static object, but rather as a process of continuous actualization of collective, or in other words, shared memory. And here I stress the word memory because it was one of the key concepts in my thesis. Because this memory feeds the self-definition among the different ethno-religious groups that associate themselves with the given heritage. Also, it is important that this collective memory possesses a certain normative dimension, which is manifested in the processes of selective forgetting, sifting, and reinventing of different histories. And it is these processes that condition the construction and reconstruction of our cultural, social, and religious identity. And therefore, the approach that I took to landscape was that landscape, basically any cultural landscape, is a memoryscape, because it reflects the different memories that are instilled into it by generations and generations of people, and by different populations that come and go. And I was looking for a term to use for my research, and I very fortunately found it in a book by Timothy Clark. Timothy Clark is an anthropological archaeologist. He's also a lecturer in archaeology and anthropology in the UK. He suggested the term landscape of memory, or in other words, the memoryscape. And I love this term a lot, although I know that it's not much in use. I decided to appropriate it in a way, of course citing the original author. So Timothy Clark's approach is that memoryscapes lie at the intersection of memory, emotion, and being somewhere, belonging to a certain place. They are always a feature of the experiential world, so this is something that we experience, something that we live in. And therefore, in this sense, all humans live within a memoryscape. So I was thinking of how to apply this concept to the different components of the heritage of the cultural landscape that I was looking at as a case studies, and I have concluded that, in fact, all the three clusters are very, very essential and very important memoryscapes for the three groups that I am discussing. Thus, for the Crimean Tatars, this memory is multi-component. Of course, in the core of it lies the memory of Bakhchisaray as a cultural and religious capital, and also the center of the only independent state that they ever had, which kind of engenders the feeling of national pride and identity. Bakhchisaray is also a very important as a notion of homeland for them, because the Tatars and the Karaids also were deported from Crimea in 1944 by the Stalinist regime, and they were not actually allowed to come back. They only began to return in the 1990s. And this notion of Bakhchisaray as a homeland was something that they were dreaming of during the years of their deportation, and that was the main goal for them, to return back home, whatever the circumstances. Of course, it is also important as a place where the Crimean Khans are buried, and the Khan's Mosque, which is part of the palace complex, is a sacred center for the Crimean Tatar community. The Medrese, which I mentioned before, the Zinjirli Medrese, is still a major religious and educational center, and the cemetery of Gazi Mansur is one of the oldest Muslim cemeteries that we can find in Crimea. Then for the Crimean Karaids, The memory of Çufut-Kale, also their cultural center and their capital, is very important as a homeland. It is also, as I mentioned, the place where their two synagogues are located, the Kenase. The oak grove of Baltai Timez is an essential sacred ritual site. And at the same time, the cemetery that lies within this oak grove is an important burial site. For Orthodox Christians, the Assumption Monastery is a witness of continuity of Christianity in Crimea from Byzantine Empire until the present. Also, it is the site of the so-called hierophany. Hierophany is a miraculous revelation. As I told you, there is this legend that the monastery was built on the site of the revelation of the Holy Mother, of the icon of the Holy Mother of God. Also, the monastery is a symbol of religious revival, even like 2 times, once in the 18th century and then once in the post-Soviet period, and it still remains a major pilgrimage destination. So my approach was such that I wanted to identify different stakeholders, the state on the one hand and the local communities on the other hand, and to see whether the memoryscape of the state, the memoryscape that the state is constructing, so to say the official memoryscape, coincides and intersects with the memoryscapes of the different religious communities that have their part in these landscapes. So here is the ideal memoryscape, so to say. This is something that I hoped to see in the end, but of course I had my doubts that it would be the case. So as you see here, the scheme is such that the memoryscape of the state, it kind of encompasses and includes equally the memoryscapes of all the 3 ethno-religious groups. And it includes all of their values, and at the same time it kind of acts as an umbrella to all of them. So the stakeholders that I identified from the side of the state was the Bakhchisaray Historical and Cultural Preserve, which, as I said, actually governs all of these sites. And then I also identified 3 different organizations presenting the interests of local religious groups. On the side of the Crimean Tatars, I identified the spiritual administrations of Muslims of Crimea. Then on the side of the Karaites, the Association of Karaites of Crimea. And on the side of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Simferopol and Crimea Diocese. Then what I did is I analyzed the different activities of all of these organizations, their content, and tried to see which memories dating back to which periods and on which themes are emphasized by the activities of each of these stakeholders and how they come together. I analyzed 4 different types of activities. Firstly, I analyzed the content and the scope of permanent and temporary exhibitions of the preserve to see what they're showing to the visitors and also to the local, local people who come to visit the museums. Also, I analyzed the cultural events such as conferences, presentations, roundtables, and festivals that are organized by each of these 4 different stakeholders, the state and the 3 organizations representing local religious groups. Then I also analyzed the scope of academic and culture-related publications as well as the educational activities to see how they disseminate, the knowledge about this heritage among different age groups, and we are particularly focused on the secondary school students. So it was a huge research. I did it in 2014, at the beginning of 2014, and I analyzed all these activities for the whole of the year of 2013, which is like the year before. And the educational activities I also analyzed in a more broad way because I looked at the curriculum, the school curriculum, and how it is being implemented currently and also some years ago, and what are probably the ideas for the future, so to say. So as the outcome of my evaluation, I will first jump to this slide. As I feared and as I expected, the memoryscape that I saw as the end, as the outcome of my assessment was not exactly the ideal one, but rather it showed that while the memoryscape of the state incorporates in a way, the interests and the memories of different other stakeholders, it doesn't do so very well. And also the problem was that the activities of the 3 organizations representing the local ethno-religious groups are extremely uncoordinated between themselves. And so just to sum up my findings, I saw that the memoryscape of the preserve, which is like the position of the state, I must admit that it does stress the region's ethnically and culturally diverse history. However, it largely overlooks the religion and the culture of the Crimean Karaites. There are almost no exhibitions devoted to it and very, very few conferences or any other activities or publications on that topic, which is kind of very weird because Çufut-Kale, the Karaite town, is one of the main sources of tourist revenue of the preserve. So it was very strange to see that they are paying so little attention to it, so to say, scientifically and in terms of knowledge dissemination. Secondly, I found that the preserve nurtures very much the Crimean Tatars' national pride, and it glorifies a lot the history of the Crimean Khanate. However, the tragic memory of the 1944 deportation and then subsequent repatriation in the 1990s is very, very underplayed. It's kind of, still very much remains a hidden topic. And I even concluded that in the preserved memoryscape, it seems almost like this dark period of deportation never existed in the Tatar history. Also, very little attention is paid to the Christian heritage of the preserve, and mainly to the Assumption Monastery that I was talking about before. Concerning organizations that represent the interests of the religious groups, it can be concluded that each of them separately and in its own line of activity is very successful in promoting knowledge and also maintaining memory that reflects different cultural aspects of their religion and culture. However, as I said, their actions are very uncoordinated. And so there is neither cooperation between the communities nor the cooperation between the preserved communities. So my conclusions were that the selected case studies are obviously landmark memoryscapes, and their protection is imperative for sustaining the shared memories of the local ethno-religious groups. However, different stakeholders produce very different memoryscapes, and very different kinds of memories are stressed in them. And in order for them to become a truly shared heritage, as this nomination to the tentative list actually aspires, definitely more cooperation should be encouraged between the preserve on one hand and the local communities on the other, and also between local communities themselves. Communities must be given more decision-making power. This was also very obvious from my assessment, that they're not participating in, neither in the day-to-day management nor in the knowledge production, so to say, that the preserve is doing. Otherwise, the memoryscapes will always remain fragmented and isolated from each other. In 2013, just as I was completing my research, actually that property was nominated by Ukraine on the World Heritage List. They submitted the nomination dossier, and the nomination unfortunately failed for many reasons, which I also researched on in my thesis, but I don't have the time to discuss now. But I do believe that part of the reason why this nomination failed was exactly that Ukraine failed to present the outstanding value of this location as something that is shared, and that's something that is related to the memory of the people who inhabit it. And so if Ukraine or Russia, I don't know, ever decides to rework the nomination and resubmit it, then I would highly recommend that they take into consideration these aspects as well. Thank you very much.